Hello, friends. So today we're going to talk about the Korean War, or the Korean conflict as some call it. And I figured a good place to start would be this particular map here. It's a satellite map showing Korea, and it's very evident by looking at this map, the two Koreas, because you can see at the top you have North Korea with very few lights shining and lighting up their country. And you can see that just north of there is China, which does have lights. And then south of there you see South Korea, which is just really lit up. It just sort of shows a disparity between the two countries and the infrastructure. And we're going to get into how we got here with this particular peninsula, the Korean peninsula, how historically what events led up to the war, and eventually we'll get into a little bit about how we got to where we are today with the two Koreas essentially with nothing resolved as of this point. So I appreciate your attention as we get into this today. For many centuries, Korea was a united country that was ruled under the Goryeo dynasty from 936 to 1392, and then also under the Yi dynasty from 1392 to 1910 AD. The Japanese had long seen it as the key to invading China. But whenever Japan would make attempts to invade Korea, China would send armies in to repel them. They would cross the Yalu River. One such event happened in 1592. For the most part over the years, China accepted Korea's sovereignty, but would demand tribute for them to remain that way. And they would essentially protect Korea from any Japanese invasions. But in the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire started vying for control of Korea. This pressure, along with diplomatic relations being established with the West, brought some changes, along with modernization creeping in. In 1894, Japanese troops invaded and destroyed the Chinese fleet. China was essentially out of the mix, and Japan and Russia rivaled each other for control of the area. Russia became active in the northern part of Korea. They established Port Arthur. While Port Arthur wasn't actually in Korea, it was at a very strategic point in China, which essentially gave Russia a perfect striking point. It was essentially a foothold where they could easily launch any invasion of Korea or any other parts of China. But Japan in 1904 captured Port Arthur. Russia's fleet was annihilated, and by 1905 Russia had no choice but to recognize Japanese control over the peninsula, and the U.S. and Great Britain went along in order to keep the peace. The Japanese occupation led to the last vestiges of the pro-China Yi dynasty being abolished, leading to formal annexation as a Japanese colony. This brought some modernization to Korea, but Japan ruled harshly in the eyes of most Koreans, leading to anti-Japanese demonstrations in 1919. It would actually be the very first infancy stages of the Korean Communist Party, with one of its leaders, Kim Il-sung, who would later be the leader of North Korea. But these communists were more of an underground movement at this point, allied with the same communists in China who would eventually take over there. As World War II came to a close, discussions began on who would control Korea. President Franklin Roosevelt, before his death, wanted Korea free of any control of China or Japan, or the Soviet Union for that matter. But after Roosevelt's death, President Truman became concerned about Soviet intentions there, and the escalation of the atomic age with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan, while designed to hasten the end of the war, There was the hoped side effect of the Soviets deciding not to invade Manchuria or Korea. The Soviets did accept Koreans' independence, at least on the surface, but Stalin made the decision to invade Manchuria and then sent troops to northeast Korea, ending up in Hwasun, a very key Korean port. With the surrender of Japan and arrangements being made, Colonel Charles Bonesteel of the U.S. Army had to quickly establish with the Soviets how Korea would be occupied. The U.S. zone would be established south of the 38th parallel, with Seoul and Incheon being in the U.S. zone. By August 15, 1945, VJ Day brought the official surrender in Japan. These arrangements essentially sped up acceptance of the 38th parallel as the border. Soviet troops entered Pyongyang August 24, 1945, and eventually lined their troops along the 38th parallel. The U.S. forces landed at Incheon. The Soviet zone had 9 million people, and the U.S. zone had 21 million people. The Soviets immediately sealed off the north and stopped all trade with the south. There were discussions for a provisional Korean government. The agreement, though, called for a 5-year trusteeship with Britain, the U.S., the Soviets, and China. Within Korea, there was opposition to this trusteeship, and by May 1946, this led to the trusteeship being dissolved, escalating the creation of a Soviet-backed government in the north and a U.S.-backed government in the south. Of course, the Cold War had reached a fever pitch worldwide. The U.S. turned the issue of Korean independence over to the United Nations. By 1946, Kim Il-sung created a pro-Chinese Communist Party called the North Korean Workers' Party. In South Korea, the Legislative Assembly was created, with half being appointed and half being elected. The UN, still in pursuit of full unification, put forth a resolution calling for free elections and the creation of a full Korean government. But the Soviet military would not let the UN enter North Korea, and free elections took place only in South Korea. By this time, the U.S. military no longer governed South Korea. The UN declared in 1948 that a lawful government had been created, and instantly the countries recognized the Republic of Korea by 1949. The northern government had been proclaimed September 9th, 1948 as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So now there were two regimes, both claiming to be the government of all Korea, staring down the barrel at each other along the 38th parallel. South Korean President Syngman Rhee had discussed possibilities of marching north, but the northern government had their own plans in mind to get control of the south. Communist-led revolts had started and turned into guerrilla warfare to attempt a coup in the south designed to topple the South Korean government. But the insurgents committed some atrocities which turned public opinion against them. The counterinsurgency pretty much ensured that the South Korean people would be against the communist attempts to subvert their government. Also aiding to this was the speedy economic recovery that was happening in South Korea. South Korea became self-supporting agriculturally as well, and industrial production improved. So at the end of 1949 and going into 1950, the strategy became more about the North wanting to invade South Korea outright. Stalin had made assurances to Kim Il-sung that he could depend on complete assistance from the Soviets, and assist they did, providing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and other equipment. Although the North Korean army was getting military training from the Soviets, and by 1950 there were 135,000 men. In South Korea, they had an organized force of 35,000 men and light artillery with no tanks. As the new Northern Army built up at the parallel, Kim Il-sung called on South Koreans to rise up and support the guerrillas, as he said, morally and materially. It was a smart tactical move on his part, as the U.S. was focusing their attention on the guerrilla fighters instead of the rising threat of the actual North Korean army, which was building up for an actual invasion. Small incursions across the border began, but North Korea typically ended up on the losing end at first, but these skirmishes were generally a distraction as well from the larger war prep that was taking place in the North. In June 1950, representatives from the North made efforts to push for peaceful unification of Korea through what they called free elections. Doing so was apparently a ruse to lull South Korea into a false sense of security as they were prepping for invasion. So, June 25, 1950, the invasion of the South by North Korea came as a huge surprise. The U.S. also had to put the defense of South Korea low on its priority list due to the threats to Europe and the Middle East. In fact, the U.S. was primarily concerned with defending Japan and its fledgling new government. North Korea's advantage early on was immense as they went headlong with their armies and tanks straight through the very ill-prepared South Korean army. The main goal was to take Seoul, and most of the North Korean army followed that path, which was west of the Taebaek Mountains. But east of the Taebaek Mountains, the North Koreans had an additional assault, partially amphibious. On June 28th, Seoul was captured by North Korea. South Korean forces essentially had nothing to stop North Korea, but North Korea decided to halt their advance to allow administration of the army to be set up in Seoul. This would lead to problems for North Korea as it allowed time for the South to reform their forces. In addition, the UN, by unanimous vote, condemned the North Korean invasion and called on them to withdraw. The Soviet Union was not present for the vote. The Security Council requested all member nations of the UN to support South Korea. President Truman announced he would immediately aid South Korea and put the Navy into Korean waters. He granted authority to General Douglas MacArthur to send U.S. forces that were occupying Japan to the Korean peninsula. MacArthur immediately went to the front lines where he observed the poor shape of the South Korean military, and it underscored the urgency of the needed troops to deploy. But while this would take some time, they were able to get some units into the theater. But in the meantime, that was no way to halt the advance, so the remaining South Korean forces and the U.S. forces retreated southeast. The purpose was to set up a perimeter that would have a geographic advantage. The Naktung River was located to the west, and then the sea was also to the east and the south. This was a better defensible position and much more concentrated. This perimeter was called the Pusan perimeter. Also, the perimeter had the advantage of mountains to the north. So in this perimeter, there were now 47,000 U.S. combat troops and 45,000 South Korean troops. More reinforcements would arrive as well, but not before the North Korean advance made the situation at the Pusan perimeter dire. In order to stop further advances, all bridges across the Naktung were blown. The struggles through the perimeter continued, but it was the resistance that was led by General Walton Harris Walker, whose organization skills were key in holding the Pusan perimeter. The one ace in the hole that Walker had was the strength of the U.S. air power, which covered much of the retreat to Pusan from other parts of Korea. Kim Il-sung started realizing that they would have to take Pusan within 2 months before their supplies ran out. The North Koreans made headway and almost captured the town of Taegu by September, but the North Korean advance had to slow down based on exhaustion and lack of supplies. The holding of the Pusan perimeter was successful. In retrospect, it could be said that the main reason the North Korean advance failed could be chalked up to trying to take too much too quickly and not having logistics worked out to ensure that they were well supplied. And the U.S. air capabilities were also another aspect. The Pusan perimeter, in contrast, was such a concentrated area that resupply was very easy for the U.S. The morale of the U.S. and UN forces had also turned, and there were other things that General MacArthur had in his back pocket that were being planned, and that was the landing of the Marines on the Korean west coast at Incheon on September 15, 1950. General MacArthur's intention was to create a beachhead near Seoul to logistically establish operations with the eventual idea of retaking Seoul. The element of surprise was important here. Seoul was a necessary step in any path of victory, but the short time frame that they had to make such a landing was an issue. MacArthur had challenges getting the needed Marines into place. The landing, codenamed Operation Chromite, depended on extra units, but also the movement of some Marines from the Pusan perimeter, which was controversial within the military because it was thought that moving the troops would weaken them. The other issue was the Incheon port itself, with the highest tidal range in the world, but the advantage to using the Incheon port was due to the disadvantages. The North Koreans could not expect an invasion there. Concerns were raised close to the appointed time as a typhoon had entered into the area, but fortunately the storm passed without issue. Prior to the landing, air attacks on Seoul had been stepped up in the hopes that they would draw attention away from the landing. The invasion at Incheon was a masterstroke. Few North Korean soldiers were there to meet the Marines. A firm beachhead was established there, and they could focus then on Seoul. By September 16th, the military headquarters was established ashore. They also seized an airfield complex, which was key to strategic air assaults for future battles. 3 days later, the Marines had advanced into the suburbs of Seoul. In the meantime, soldiers began advancing out of the Pusan perimeter. The Soviets advised the South Koreans to withdraw their forces from around the Pusan perimeter and refocus on defending Seoul. It was all too little too late. The U.S. and UN forces took Seoul. On September 25th, U.S. air raids caused heavy damage to the North Korean tanks and its artillery. The North Korean troops in South Korea were unable to withdraw north, and only about 25,000 made it back. Stalin called an emergency session and condemned the incompetence of North Korea's administration of the war. General Douglas MacArthur started turning his attention to possibly mounting an invasion north of the 38th parallel. The South Korean government was reestablished in Seoul in the meantime. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued a directive to MacArthur. It stated that his primary objective was the destruction of the North Korean army. The secondary objective was to reunite all of Korea. But the Joint Chiefs were concerned that if actual Chinese or Soviet troops deployed into North Korea, that could present a problem. If it turned into an all-out world war with China and the Soviets as allies, it could be more than they were willing to accept. By September 30th, in fact, China indicated that they were prepared to send troops in if the U.S. were to cross the 38th parallel. But on October 1st, the North Korean armies had retreated north out of South Korea, but the South Korean armies chased them. Douglas MacArthur demanded that North Korea unconditionally surrender. On October 7th, with UN authority, forces followed the South Korean armies north to Wonsan. In the meantime, the 8th U.S. Army captured Pyongyang. By October 19th, MacArthur believed the next and only step was to enter China to destroy supply lines, but Truman overruled him. Stalin requested that Mao Zedong send divisions into Korea with the understanding that the Soviets would not be intervening. The only issue Mao had with sending troops is that he had planned to use them to invade Taiwan, but decided that sending troops into Korea was a better course of action as the U.S. naval presence around Taiwan was far too intense. On October 10th, the Chinese delegation arrived in Moscow to see what support that the Soviets could provide. Stalin agreed to only send ammunition and equipment. He also agreed to send air support, but only the following March. Mao was not satisfied with this lack of commitment, but China had decided that they would intervene in spite of not having Soviet support. On October 15th, MacArthur met Truman on Wake Island. MacArthur had refused to travel to the U.S. to meet him, a move that some had seen as being non-compliant. MacArthur told Truman he didn't believe that the Chinese would enter Korea. In the meantime, China sent troops into North Korea overnight on October 19th, then launched an offensive 6 days later. After this happened, the Soviets reconsidered and sent air support to aid China. This led to the U.S. 8th Cavalry being assaulted at Unsan. The forces had retreated back over the Chongcheng River. Eventually, the Chinese forces led the 8th Army, retreating back across to the 38th parallel. Eventually, the UN forces in Pyongyang had to evacuate with about 4.5 million refugees that fled south. By this time, China had essentially asserted authority over North Korean forces, and Kim Il-sung was no longer making decisions for the army. In December of 1950, the UN presented a ceasefire to the Chinese and North Koreans who had felt emboldened by their latest series of victories. Then they decided to go ahead and reject it based on those victories that they had recently had. They were determined to take the whole of the Korean peninsula. In 1951, Mao and the Chinese mounted a major offensive that resulted in UN forces losing Seoul again on January 4, 1951. Then the Chinese decided to focus on resting and reorganizing before mounting the next offensive. MacArthur, by this time, feeling the desperation, wanted nuclear weapons to be used in China in hopes of disrupting supply chains. This was not agreeable to the Truman administration. By February 1951, battles continued around the 38th parallel, with one major battle having 5,600 South Korean and U.S. and French troops outnumbered and surrounded by 25,000 Chinese and North Korean forces. Though outnumbered, the UN troops won the battle. Many more battles continued, with Seoul getting recaptured and back under South Korean control. By March 14, 1951, Mao Zedong by this time went back to Stalin for more support to help improve supply lines. Stalin agreed. By this time, though, the Chinese and North Korean forces were reeling, having suffered 53,000 casualties in 3 months. By April, Truman relieved MacArthur as commander, citing mainly disagreements over nuclear weapons and not happy of the results of the offensive north of the 38th parallel. Also, his insistence of wanting to take the war into China was a strategic disagreement that they could not overcome. The other reason Truman likely exercised restraint was the thought that the Soviets would become more involved in the war if it was taken into China. By April 1951, the Chinese-North Korean armies launched an offensive near Seoul. The offensive was costly, as casualties for the UN were only 4,000 compared to over 40,000 for China and North Korea, but the losses would get worse as they retreated north, losing 45 to 60,000 more troops. The UN decided, with the US's lead, to head north of the 38th parallel. 6 miles worth of land north of the parallel was captured. These setbacks changed the focus of the war for China, who now focused on self-preservation for themselves in North Korea and became less focused on total victory over South Korea and the UN. The refocus led to a period of time between July 1951 and 1953 known as the stalemate. North Korea was heavily bombed, and talks began of possible armistice in July of 1951, but the combat would continue. The U.S. and UN wanted to be sure at the very least that all South Korean territory was recaptured. There was considerable artillery fighting, and the U.S. had the advantage. There were also guerrilla fighters in South Korea that were sympathetic with the North that also had to be a focus. The North had loads of issues with logistics, which had been a major issue for most of the war, and the negotiations would continue alongside all of the battles. November 29, 1952, after being elected president, but prior to taking office, Dwight D. Eisenhower visited Korea in hopes of bringing the war to a swift end. Eisenhower would be sworn in on January of 1953. 2 months later, Joseph Stalin died, brought forth another shift towards the end of the war, as now the Soviets had power struggles to concern themselves with. They wanted to withdraw their support, which put China in a tough position. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed between the UN, China, and North Korea. South Korean President Syngman Rhee would not sign the agreement. No formal peace treaty was in place, and a demilitarized zone essentially around the 38th parallel, which is still being patrolled by North Korea and South Korea and the U.S. to this day. The war never officially ended. but there have been moments where talks of the war ending have occurred. But in the last decade, North Korea's escalation of their nuclear capability seems to ensure that the war may never officially end. Any official end would require nuclear disarmament. As of the recording of this video, it is questionable whether that commitment could possibly be honored. I want to thank you for your attention in this video today and hope that you will continue to like, subscribe, and watch my content. Thank you so much. Have a good day.